The Kurukshetra battlefield is a storm of iron and rage. Chariot wheels grind into the dry, cracked earth, churning up a thick, choking veil of dust that hides the sun. The air vibrates with the deafening roar of conch shells and the rhythmic, bone-shaking thud of thousands of marching feet. Arjuna stands at the center of this chaos, his fingers white-knuckled around the grip of his bow Gandiva. He scans the horizon, expecting the faces of enemies, but his gaze catches on the opposing ranks. He sees his own kin. He sees his revered teachers. He sees the childhood friends who once shared his bread. The roar of the battlefield seems to recede into a dull, distant hum. His knees buckle under the weight of the realization. The bow slips from his numbed grip, clattering sharply against the floor of his chariot. He sinks down, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He stares at the vast, blood-soaked field, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Arjuna stared at his own trembling hands, the metal of the chariot floor cold against his knees. He could not look up at the ranks of men waiting for the signal to slaughter one another. He turned his head toward the charioteer, his voice barely audible over the distant clash of shields. "Krishna, look at them. How can I draw an arrow against my own blood? My own teachers? My own kin?" He gripped the edge of the chariot, his knuckles straining against the wood. What value is there in a victory built upon the ashes of those I love? If I win this, I win only a graveyard. If death is the final destination, this war is nothing but a hollow tragedy. When the heart stops and the body returns to the dust, the person is gone forever. Everything they were simply vanishes into the void. Tell me, what is the point of a triumph that requires the total erasure of everything that gives life meaning? Krishna stood motionless amidst the swirling dust. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not acknowledge the arrows whistling overhead or the screams of the dying. He simply watched the horizon with eyes that held the stillness of the deep ocean. The cacophony of the battlefield seemed to bend around him, unable to touch the quiet center he occupied. He turned slowly to face Arjuna. His voice cut through the roar of the war like a steady, unwavering bell, clear and absolute. "Arjuna, you speak of grief, yet you mourn for those who exist beyond the reach of sorrow. You look at the surface of the river and you fear the ripples. You tremble at the movement of the water, forgetting that the water itself remains unchanged regardless of the surface disturbance." A subtle, golden luminescence began to emanate from Krishna, casting long, soft shadows across the floor of the chariot. The air around them grew dense, vibrating with a frequency that ignored the nearby clash of steel. Krishna leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Arjuna with a weight that demanded total attention. "The wise do not measure existence by the decay of flesh," he stated, his voice steadying the very ground beneath them. "The body is merely a vessel, a temporary shell that wears thin with time. But that which dwells within, the Atman, is beyond the reach of time." As he spoke, the battlefield began to fade into a translucent overlay, the soldiers and chariots losing their solidity. Krishna gestured toward the vision. Just as a traveler discards worn-out items to acquire fresh ones, the soul casts aside a broken body to take up a new one. Arjuna looked up, his brow furrowed, as the golden light pushed back the encroaching darkness of his doubt. "So what we call death is not destruction? It is merely a shift in state?" Krishna stood firm as the horizon began to ripple. The iron wheels of the chariots, the dust, and the roar of the war started to lose their density, thinning into a haze of gray light. He raised a hand, and the heavy atmosphere of the battlefield seemed to peel away like dry parchment. "Exactly," Krishna repeated, his voice resonating with a power that transcended the space between them. "It is a shift in state, a movement from one reality to another. Weapons cannot pierce it. Fire cannot consume it. Water cannot dissolve it. It is the fundamental constant of the universe." He swept his hand across the clearing, and the ground beneath them became transparent. The soldiers below stopped moving, frozen in a silent, suspended animation. "It is untouched by the elements that govern the physical world," he continued. "You fear the blade because you identify with the steel that can be broken. You fear the flame because you identify with the fuel that can be burned. but that which is real within you is not subject to the laws of decay. The air grew cold, then warm, then still, as the battlefield dissolved into nothingness. Arjuna watched the space where the war had been, his eyes widening. The last remnants of the battlefield evaporated, leaving only a vast, swirling expanse of deep violet and gold. Nebulae stretched across the horizon, vast clouds of stardust expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic motion. Arjuna stood in the center of this void, his feet finding purchase on nothing but light. The stars pulsed in a steady, synchronized beat. Krishna stood beside him, his presence now indistinguishable from the light itself. "This cycle has turned since the dawn of time," Krishna said. "Birth, life, death, and rebirth. It is the eternal rhythm of the cosmos, spinning endlessly." Arjuna watched as a star collapsed into a dense point of gravity, only to erupt moments later into a brilliant, new cluster of light. The fear that had gripped his heart in the chariot was replaced by the weight of this cosmic motion. He was no longer a soldier on a field. The pulse of the universe quickened, matching the rhythm of his own breath, until the distinction between the observer and the observed began to blur. The swirling nebulae condensed, cooling into the sharp, sterile lines of a modern laboratory. Monitors hummed with the rhythmic flicker of neural pathways, glowing blue and white against the dark room. Arjuna watched the complex web of light, the firing synapses of a human mind caught in high-resolution detail. Krishna gestured to the screen, his presence a calm anchor in the clinical space. Even now, humanity gazes into the machinery of the brain, searching for the seat of consciousness, he said, his voice steady against the hum of the cooling fans. They ask the same question I answered eons ago. What remains when the biological machine stops? The neural web on the monitor began to dim, the pathways fading until only a single, brilliant point of light remained, pulsing in the center of the display. They look for the spark in the wires, hoping to map the soul through physical interaction, Krishna continued. But the spark is not the wire. The spark is the observer itself. Arjuna leaned closer, watching the light hold its position even as the surrounding data vanished. The observer remained, untouched by the power down of the biological system. The clinical hum of the laboratory dissolved into silence. Arjuna stood in the stillness, the weight of his previous doubt replaced by a cold, clear focus. Krishna watched him, his expression softening into a smile of profound peace that seemed to bridge the gap between the infinite and the immediate. "You have seen the observer," Krishna said, his voice resonant and firm. "Now, understand your true nature. You are not the flesh that ages, nor the mind that flickers with doubt. You are the eternal self." Arjuna felt the last remnants of his internal storm subside. The fear that had paralyzed his limbs in the chariot now felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. It had lost its grip, unable to find purchase on the truth he now held. "If the body is a shadow," Arjuna asked, his voice steady, "what truly matters?" Krishna leaned forward, his gaze piercing through the remaining illusions of the battlefield. "Once that truth anchors your soul, you act not for the result, but for the duty itself. Desire for the outcome is the chain that binds you to the cycle of suffering. Break that chain. Act because it is your path, not because you crave the destination." Arjuna felt the final barrier fall. The battlefield was no longer a place of tragedy, but a space for action. He stood firm, the hesitation gone, ready to fulfill his purpose. Arjuna stood tall, his posture firm and unyielding against the backdrop of the waiting field. The internal storm that had once clouded his judgment had cleared, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. He reached down, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar grip of the Gandiva. He lifted the bow, the wood steady in his hands, and drew it upward. The weight of the weapon felt natural. He looked across the battlefield, but the faces of his kin no longer stirred the paralysis of doubt. He stood as a participant in the cosmic rhythm, ready to fulfill his duty without hesitation. Krishna watched him, his gaze steady and calm. The final words hung in the air. "That which is real, Arjuna, never ceases to be." The battlefield roared back to life, the sound of conch shells and marching feet rising to meet the sky. Arjuna did not flinch. He adjusted his stance, pulled the string of his bow, and prepared to engage. The doubt was gone. There was only the duty, the action, and the eternal truth that stood beyond the reach of time. He took a single step forward, his movement precise and deliberate, and the war began.